Hassan, can you hear us?
Good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Are we going to have video or no?
Seems to be active on my side. Are you not able to
There
see?
we go.
There we go.
There we go. There we go. Good morning, Mr. Hassan. I am Dan Reeser. I'm the chairman of the board, and we appreciate you appearing today for your interview as a candidate for appointment to the Taxicab Administrator position.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to have some questions for you, and then at the end of the questioning, Administrator Decker will kind of explain how the process goes from here. But I'm gonna lead off with the first question. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
First question is, give us your 3-minute elevator speech on why you are the best candidate to be selected administrator.
Well, I am one of few candidates, I imagine, that you've got in your pool that is very well diversified in his experience in transportation, specifically surface transportation overall, with a background in public transportation, overseeing fixed route and paratransit, having been and having overseen a taxi cab authority from an administrator position in Prince George's County between the years of 2014. I also bring DMV experience from a policy standpoint. And of course, for those of us that have been in taxi cab authority positions, we know that a lot of synergy exists between what the DMV does inherently as a process from a policy and licensing and auditing and QA and QC standpoint. And as the administrator out in Hawaii, I was doing exactly that with an entire team reporting to me from an inspection standpoint, taking care of auditing not only TNCs like Lyft and Uber, but also taxi cab companies as well, making sure that vehicles were within compliance, and of course, ensuring that there is equitability in the field of play. So, all in all, with 2 bachelor's degrees, one in information technology, a master's degree in public administration with a focus on project management and statistics, and considerable, almost 2 decades worth of knowledge base, having served in public transportation, overseeing a taxi cab authority as part of that purview, interacting with regional governmental agencies, and having been an administrator in multiple roles throughout the government sector and even in the private sector. I believe the plethora of my experience and the well-roundedness of my experience from multiple jurisdictions carries a lot of value to challenging times as we're experiencing and continue to experience, whether it's the COVID phase of what you experienced in Las Vegas between 2020 and 2021. And I was in Reno at that time running a citywide transportation system, or whether it was the 2012 to 20 until today timeframe in which we're continuing to deal with disruptive technologies that are challenging the status quo of the livelihoods of the very people that we've, as an industry, invested considerable time and resources in. I hope that was 3 minutes.
Member Thompson.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question that sort of follows on to that answer. Which of your employment leadership positions best prepare you for the administrator's job?
Well, what I mentioned was that in Prince George's County, where I was the chief of transportation, part of my purview was overseeing the taxi cab department division as a whole. Inspectors reporting to me. I actually revised the code for the Taxi Cab Commission in Prince George's County, just as not microtransit, TNCs were coming to fruition. And so, again, having dealt with uniformity of code, uniformity of the fleet, having disseminated permit testing, having run vehicles through metered courses, having worked with inspectors to chase after gypsy cabs, those are all the things that I have done that I believe are directly translatable to what you were looking for in this position on behalf of your agency. The added value, of course, is that, outside of that, I've also done a lot of public transportation, which has its own componency in terms of dispatching. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe your dispatching is centralized. From a procedural standpoint, as far as I could tell, you have the administration side, and then you have the enforcement side, which also has the dispatching component. And so, again, not too many people, even in this industry, have actually run an operation, and I've certainly run operations to the tune of, it was $45 million overseeing a local transportation system in Prince George's County. It was about $35 to $40 million in Anchorage, Alaska. In Hawaii, it was about $400 million of revenue overseeing the DMV. And since then, it's averaged anywhere between 25 to 40 million for the projects that I've worked on. But doing the day-to-day operations, understanding the KPIs, understanding the metrics that go into making your monthly reports, in which, for the month of September, you were showing 89% increase in trips year over year between 2020 and 2021, or whether it was a 6.3% increase in your revenue. Number one being Lucky Cab, and number two being YCS Cab 3. Those are elements that you only understand if you've walked a mile in the shoes of the very people that run operations. And I'm happy to report that, again, my considerable experience enables me and has demonstrated that I have been able to run operations.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you very much.
Member Rodriguez.
Yes, sir. What do you consider the biggest public safety challenges for an agency like the authority? And second part of that is, how will you address these challenges?
Well, the playing field continues to evolve. Obviously, the challenges vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but there are certainly commonalities. I realize that a lot of what the inspectors undertake in the field of play is ensuring that, licenses and medallions are being displayed appropriately, that the signage is being displayed appropriately to the public. There's also the safety component and awareness component, that the public knows that when you're getting on a taxi cab, that if there is a credit card fee per the Nevada revised statute, that is going to be a surcharge on top of the metered portion, then that is something that they're fully aware of. It's about awareness, right? Because when they are utilizing, whether it's the Curb Mobility app to hail a taxi, or whether they're utilizing Uber and Lyft, part of what we're in the age of information getting used to is making sure that the public is aware of exactly what the cost is going to be as they traverse from point A to point B. So awareness is certainly a challenge. And then, of course, what we do in this industry best, which I think TNCs have still get to catch up for, which is the safety component, right? And again, sort of being on this side of this, and you certainly being in the industry as a whole, I don't know if the taxis in Las Vegas are partitioned, but that is a safety component. Classically, as I grew up in New York, a lot of the taxis were partitioned for creating the safety barrier between passengers and drivers and passengers. And as we watch the news these days, certainly we live in challenging times where the threshold for perhaps patience and civility continues to be breached. And certainly in a city like Las Vegas, where a lot of the participants are going to casinos and might be partaking in different venues, safety is of critical importance, and making sure that drivers are being held accountable to the revised statutes and the policies of their companies, and that passengers are frankly doing the right thing when they're boarding these vehicles. For anything from making sure the vehicle is not damaged to ensuring that we're not running into those types of stories where you read about in the morning newspaper that another Lyft or Uber driver has been assaulted by a passenger over a payment dispute, right? And so again, in terms of safety, to me, that is critical. It's critical to keep passengers safe. It's critical to keep drivers safe. And I certainly feel that part of that criticality is when you ensure that all parties are aware of what their requirements are. It's about setting expectations. I do that in a managerial capacity with my employees, but certainly educating our riding public and educating our drivers on those expectations certainly goes a long way to mitigating future challenges.
Thank you.
Member Soderberg.
Walk us through some instances where you've changed or improved the work culture of an organization.
I'll give you a little backstory, and that is that obviously my first job starting out wasn't the director of an agency. I worked my way through college and drove buses. I got my CDL, and that was a way for me to not take student loans. I mentioned that because I still have my CDL and I still hold my endorsements, not because I drive buses, but because to me, you have to walk a mile in the shoes of your workforce to be able to appreciate what they do for a living. It's not easy dealing with customers. And of course, the writing and the paying customers may certainly be of a different clientele when you're dealing with taxis than when you're dealing with public transportation. But at the end of the day, it's about diffusing tensions. And unless you've actually undertaken those jobs and unless you've actually sat with those very people that are doing this day in, day out, it's very hard to be able to walk in and say, hey, I can relate to you, because trust takes time to build. And if you don't have that authenticity of experience, I find that you struggle a lot more. So going back to your question of, when you've changed the morale of an agency, it's about understanding the paradigm of where our inspectors are coming from, understanding the paradigm of where our dispatchers are coming from, understanding the paradigm of what our administration, folks in our administration are dealing with. And for me, I do not take my skill set or my experience for granted. What I like to do is I come into an agency and I'm a blank slate. I like to learn about the issues that those folks are experiencing because they've been there for a considerably longer time that I have been. And my job, frankly, yes, part of it is setting the vision, but a lot more is making sure that I understand the woes of where these folks are coming from, whether it was past management that their views did not align with, whether it was not equitable opportunities, or whether it was simply, it takes a lot to ensure that you care for your employees, and little things like thank you and sorry go a long way, because we're all humans and we all make mistakes. And so what I've been able to do in the agencies that I've come in is, again, not take any assumptions, make sure that I listen to what my employees have to say, that the vision is clear, that there is a level of transparency that I'm sharing with my staff, and that they understand the clockwork that they are a part of, and they understand where the goals are, and they understand what the milestones are that we're going to travel together. And mine is to clear the hurdles for them so that they can succeed in the very jobs that they do. And when you can do that, when you can learn about your employees, and when you're able to relate to them, and when you're able to appreciate them for who they are, I find that you're able to get a lot more done. And that is sort of the mantra that I've sort of practiced in my professionalism, in my career. It's leadership through servitude, and that is what I continue to aspire to do.
Member Thompson.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Can you describe a career situation that presented a unique problem that required you to come up with an out-of-the-box solution? Now,
Absolutely.
Now let me say, this is not a difficult question, but it's one, if I were asked that, I would stare into space for quite a while. Okay, would you like me to state it again, or do you understand it?
No, I believe I understand it. So let me sort of
Okay.
give you perhaps maybe one of two examples. When I left Prince George's County, we were just on the cusp of realizing the impact that Lyft and Uber were beginning to have on the erosion of the taxi cab industry. And so while I had revised the code to address things like fees and the way the lottery program works for new medallions, essentially, taking care of deficits in the industry, such as not having enough ADA eligible vehicles. What I realized in hindsight is that none of those revision changes really fully sort of took on the challenge and the mantra of how to deal with this problem, if you will, to a certain degree, or this challenge that we would have for the next few years. And this challenge wasn't just affecting the taxicab industry. Taxicab industry was certainly the first one to run up against this issue, but public transportation thereafter was soon to follow. When I moved up to Anchorage, Alaska, that hit home fully, and that hit home when Uber started lobbying the legislature, and we were beginning to lose control at a local level because they weren't going to the local assembly. Clark County, as an example, they weren't going to the assembly or the council members of Clark County to be able to make revision changes to the code to accommodate Lyft. They were actually going to the state legislature and having the governor and the senators override the code at a state level so that the locality literally had no control at all. And they were investing millions of dollars in doing that. So that hit home for me because this was not my first rodeo, it was my second rodeo in Anchorage, Alaska, and that was one of the last states they were starting to get into. But once that occurred, the public transportation was sort of in a state of denial. And most of these transit agencies around the 2014, 2015 timeframe really didn't know what to do, much like the taxicab industry, but I had seen this happen once before. So what I started to do was figure out a strategy on, well, how do we deal with this challenge, or are we going to suffer the same losses that I was seeing the taxicab industry suffer in places like New York, as an example? The solution that I came up with collectively with my staff was to begin sort of investing in technology that would give us an equitable turf, because I felt like we still had enough time. And so we started converting and having conversations with private sector companies, which again, 2 decades ago, you as an agency might do your own programming. That's no longer the case. Innovation generally isn't something that government does anymore. It's left to the private sector side. And so we tapped on the shoulders of the private sector, and we went to companies that were just getting into the domain of creating software related to CAD AVL. And one of those companies is called Transloc out of, I think, North Carolina. And we brought them up here and we had some discussions and we began a preliminary pilot test to essentially use the vehicles that we already had, which was for paratransit vehicles. You see them in Vegas all the time as cutaways. And utilizing their app, Transloc, we were actually creating the first iteration of how to basically have our fleet interchangeably do not only paratransit, but also do ad hoc pickups for the first and last mile associated with public transportation. But again, for us, it was, well, we could either continue to have Lyft and Uber essentially convince the public that they are public transportation while we lose funding on the federal side, or we could actually partner with companies that have similar softwares. And of course, you have Curb Mobility in Las Vegas, and see what we might be able to do to frankly compete with Uber and Lyft and see how that plays out. And, years later now, happy to report for whatever it's worth that what I see is that it went from Transloc doing a pilot for $25,000 in 2014, 2015 to dozens upon dozens of companies today selling CAD AVL features that have a micro transit component. And that terminology came to fruition sometime in 2017 after the FDA did its sandbox pilot projects to be able to say micro transit is a solution. That's where when big buses can't go there, you use micro transit. And it's very Uber-esque or Lyft-ish in its approach to essentially evolving what public transportation looks like. So that to me was a challenge. It was something nuanced in the industry, and we rose to the occasion. One final example I'll give you is Reno, Nevada. In 2020, in June of 2020, when the pandemic really hit home and no one really knew what was going on, none of us knew how to deal with this challenge. Most transit agencies had decided, you know what, the risk is too much, we're going to shut down, and we're either going to reduce our services by a margin of 50% or 75%. And on the private sector side, for the management contractors, the decision was, well, we don't even know what the liability is, so let's just see if we can do a force majeure, contract negotiation with our clients, the Regional Transportation Commission, as the case might be, and essentially convince them to send our operators home, and we're not going to run services at all. Against that tide, in Northern Nevada, we made a decision not to do that collectively with our client. And we were one of maybe less than a dozen entities across the nation that actually operated service at 100% capacity, not because the ridership was there, but because we believed that this was the appropriate thing to do. And having done that, not only did we sort of ensure that we weren't laying off employees, but that we were providing critical and essential services throughout Northern Nevada. And no one knew what 2021 would bring in terms of gas taxes or other revenues. And of course, you've seen this in your own agency in terms of the decline that you felt was carrying over from 2020 to 2021. And had the restrictions not lifted in Las Vegas, obviously would have been a repeat of 2020 all over again, because the ridership volume would have continued to diminish. Northern Nevada was going through the same iteration, but they hung in there. And the byproduct of that is, whereas most agencies now are coming to an understanding of, oh, yes, we should actually increase our services and let's wait on the federal funding to come in. Well, Washoe County is not having to deal with that because they saved the federal CARES Act money that they had, and they're going to spend it on a rainy day if they have it in the future. But they were able to keep services continuing when, frankly, the tide was against them, and this was not a very popular opinion at that time. So 2 iterations, or perhaps 2 examples, one for microtransit and the other one for when you have a pandemic and no one really knows what to do, but you stick to your guns to a certain degree, and it's paid off in the case of Washoe County.
All right, thank you very much. I
You're welcome.
appreciate that.
Mr. Hassan, can you share with us what's been your biggest career disappointment?
I might have more than one. So this one I do have to stare off into space and go, let me think here for a second. One of them is happening right now. I would say that I left the private company that I worked for in January-ish of 2021, and I'm sort of a management consultant working for a company called MTM in Eastern Oregon these days, doing a facilitation of a startup project. But the prior company that I was with was undergoing a lot of challenges with the union. And for those of you that might be sort of keeping up with the Nevada news, what you'll see is that they're on their 3rd strike right now with the union. And so I would say one of my biggest disappointments is, I came from a background in which I'm a firm believer in the value of having unions. And up until sort of Washoe County, I've had excellent relationships with the unions that I've worked with. And so I guess my disappointment is that leading up to 2021, we knew that the strike was going to happen, and this was going to be a challenging time. And despite my best effort, that is not something that I was able to change. And so what Washoe County is experiencing right now is something that sort of was built upon month after month, year after year. And that is a disappointment on my part, because certainly there might have been a way to avoid that in hindsight, had we done as a company things a little differently in the past. That's probably the most visible sort of disappointment that I've got in my career.
Thank you. Member Soto.
What is your view of using progressive discipline in personnel matters, and in what situation do you believe is a useful human resources management tool?
That is an excellent question, and I apologize. What I was thinking about was something that a mentor of mine had sort of told me. He was a city manager in Alaska, and he said you could look at you could look at an individual and you could look at their best values, or you could look at their worst values, and that's a reflection on you more so than any deficiency or in whether competence or skill set on your employee. And I career to look at the best in individuals as opposed to the worst in individuals. That's not to say that all situations are reconcilable. So have really very honest conversations and set expectations up front, because I feel that the deficit is always when you walk into a situation where the employee doesn't really understand what is expected of them, and yet somehow, as an administrator, very classically, you take a very bad approach to doing an annual performance review, and yet you never set the expectation. You never went the mile to sit down with them, whether it was on a weekly basis, a biweekly basis, or a quarterly basis, to say, hey, you're doing great, and this is where you need to go, and these are the things that you need to correct. And if you haven't done that as a manager, then frankly, you're not much of a manager. And so what I like to do is, well in advance, is get to know my people, get to understand where they're coming from, and find their strong points, because we all have them, right? You can't fit a square into a circle, but certainly there are ways to take advantages of the strong suits that people have. And I've dealt with situations coming up in my career as we've done succession planning, generationally speaking, where you find that as technology was advancing, you had people who came up through their careers that were on the verge of retirement, but their skill set had never caught up to the technological innovation that was happening in the field of play. And so they would look at, someone like me, and I can type really fast, and they would be impressed by that. Now I look at kids, and they're doing programming, and they're in third grade, as the case might be, right? And I'm very impressed by that. So it's about making sure that you take the skill set and the experience of the individuals that you have that are working with you, and finding sort of a quality approach to problem resolution, because it is there. But to answer your question about sort of progressive discipline, I highlighted all of this leading up to this, the answer, because I like mentoring and I like training at a variety of different levels, because I want to give people the opportunity to excel in what they do. I firmly believe people, when they're working, they're not coming to just collect a paycheck and they hate their jobs. I believe that they've invested themselves. I mean, that's the value of public service to a large degree. You've invested a portion of yourself, and you want to make sure you leave a legacy behind. And that is true for our employees. But there are certainly occasions in which it might be a small mistake. Maybe it's an attendance issue, and you sit down and you try to understand through compassion and empathy, well, what's going on? Tell me what's going on and how I might be able to help. Are you having issues because you don't have a babysitter, as the case might be? Those to me are resolvable issues, whether it's a reasonable accommodation or whatever, an alternate schedule, as the case might be, especially this year. I mean, I'm in an industry where we are as short of drivers as we've ever been in any decade prior, right? And so it takes a necessity to a certain degree to go to that next step to say, I want to understand your situation, because we want to create an atmosphere that is conducive to both you you as an employee and us as an employer. And you have to work with those individuals. But if you've done that and you're finding that there are still, critical misses over time, then obviously, yes, at a certain level, it is progressive discipline, because you're going through either it's the collective bargaining agreement or whether it's, the employee handbook, and you're saying, well, listen, we talked, but it seems like you reneged on the conversation that we had, and you still erred. And so now I have to record something, right? You went from oral to written, and maybe written ends up being something like a suspension, depending on what the progressive discipline looks like. But you're giving them opportunities to make sure that you're able to resolve issues. And if you're not, and they're sort of deviating from the plan, then it is progressive discipline. On the managerial end, it's looked a little differently for me. I like to introduce something called a performance improvement plan, if it ever gets to that level. And that's not necessarily to the point of saying, hey, you know what, I'm just going to jot everything down and we're done with it. Because I firmly believe that I have a role to play as a manager in making sure that the expectations are clear. And so when I've introduced a performance evaluation plan in consultation with HR, it is to say, maybe somewhere in our conversation, maybe it's me, I haven't been clear in terms of what the expectations are. So this piece of paper, or pieces of paper, basically outlines where I feel that there is room for improvement. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with you. We're going to set up weekly meetings in which you and I are going to sit down. We're going to go over this task list and make sure that you're meeting the KPIs that have been set for you. And whether it's tools that you need, or whether it's hurdles that you need me to clear out, or whether it's support that I might be able to provide or your peers might be able to provide, that's what those weekly meetings are for. But if it still escalates to a point where some people they do, unfortunately, they shrug off the responsibility, then yes, that PIP may be extended, or it might frankly ultimately lead to a separation. And those are unfortunate aspects of my job that I've had to do in the past. And at the end of the day, again, laying out expectations, making sure that they're clear and concise, ensuring that your people have the tools that they need. And despite all of those things, if it's still progresses towards a downhill sort of situation, then progressive discipline as a last approach to either remedy the issue or, unfortunately, separate the individual from employment and find someone that is foreseeably more qualified and happier to be in the position that they're in. But you take your job away, not me trying to take it away from you.
Okay, Mr. Hassan, what is the most important skill set for a leader in a law enforcement agency?
I believe the values for leadership are shared across agencies as a whole, but it starts out with, making sure that there is cohesion in the team that you've got. And that starts out with making sure that you're having dialogue and communication, because as a leader, I feel it's your prerogative to bring people together, to bring down the silos and start opening up the lines of communication with your employees and listening to what they have to say, listening to the problems that they're being faced with, and then delivering on a solution, right? By not only setting the expectations, but seeing through on the promises that you're making to them. But beyond that, I feel that it's having a clear and concise vision. Where are we going as an agency? And why are we doing what we do? And then what is our role in getting to that vision? And incrementally, how are we tracking our progress? Are we doing good on a month-to-month basis? Are we doing bad? And if there is improvement to be had, getting together in a room, making sure that we're listening to what could improve the KPIs that are. So, again, a variety of different things, but I believe that leadership is about setting a vision. But more than setting a vision, it's about being a shepherd to a certain degree and making sure that the folks that you are responsible for understand that vision and understand their role in that vision and how to make it happen. When I was a lot younger, the thought process was, well, maybe you do need to be the person that has the greatest ideas. And what I find as I've gotten older is that, that's not necessarily true of leadership. My job is to make sure to bring out the best in the people that I have around me and to bring them up with me. And if you can do that, then I feel that you're a successful leader, because you're creating a platform for an agency from a sustainability standpoint, in which the resource pool that we have are, the very folks that work with us and for us will be the future of that agency moving forward. Because if we don't do that, and if we do the things that I've seen happen in my career as I was coming up, which is, some people do sort of this grab of knowledge thing, and they feel like that's somehow job security. That is not the way to go, because at the end of the day, if that's the approach to management, then you fail as a leader, your employees fail, and frankly, the very agency that you work for fails. And I've, again, over the course of my career, made sure that innovation is key and that I am bringing my people up along with me, because they are the positive resource that the agency requires to overcome the challenges that, frankly, we may not be seeing right now, because these agencies, are a lot older in their prospect than we will be.
Thank you.
Member Thompson.
Okay, I have one final question, and it's a question that's near and dear to my heart,
Okay.
because it is central to the problem we're facing today. And that is, what is the major challenge facing the taxicab industry today? And let me go into a little bit more detail.
Let him answer. Just let
Okay,
him answer.
no, I'll just let him answer. Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I certainly would have appreciated your perspective. I mean, I think I've sort of touched on this a little bit in terms of, I go back and I think about, um, I grew up in New York, by the way, and my family immigrated from another country. And at some juncture in my life when I was a kid, for those of you that might be familiar with New York, they had taxis, limousines, and they had these things called TLCs, which were sort of a hybrid in between back in the days, back in the 90s. And my dad used to sort of drive one of them for a little while until he sort of moved on. But I think back to the stories that I read years later, and even sort of traversing through that time as a kid. In those circles, people invested their entire livelihood on the prospect of possibly making a career for themselves. And you heard stories, crazy stories like $600,000 for a medallion. They would mortgage their houses off just to get a medallion in New York. And that is a story that not too many in the public can either understand or appreciate. But that is a story of the two halves of America, the have nots and the haves, in which you have people that have invested their faith in an industry, which is what you are. You're an industry. And they've invested not only their careers, but their finances. And so when all of this was happening in terms of disruptive technology coming to fruition, um, the question that I kept going back to was, what an unfortunate situation that the market value of the whole thing has dropped by a margin of 80 to 90%. And, we as an authority were trying to come up with some sort of a solution to still have this be a manageable prospect, not knowing whether this was the end of the industry as we knew it or whether something else was going to happen. I don't think that challenge has necessarily died off, even though we found sort of a ledge, if you will, of sustainability in the industry. And those might be, your airport locations and your casinos, where you have your taxi cab stands. But the overall challenge of what to do with sort of this market value has not gone away. And certainly, as we, as I have seen, I won't say we because we may not sort of share this opinion, is that as disruptive technology through startups continues to saturate the market, we don't necessarily know that this ledge that we're on is a sustainable one and how to move on to that next prospect. So the challenge to me is one of equitability, right? I mentioned to you Anchorage, Alaska, and the fact that Uber had come in. The thing that I didn't mention is that all the conversations I was having with the legislature in terms of saying, well, what about safety? And what about security? What about the QA, QC portion of it? The fact that, at least during that time, you could doctor a PDF file and send it into Uber and they would accept it because the check mechanism on the back end didn't really exist, even though they said that it did. And by virtue of the opposite on the taxi cab industry, you're so heavily regulated that not only are you going through FBI fingerprinting processes, but you've got inspectors that are actually in the field of play inspecting these vehicles and holding them to a higher standard than those TNCs. And this equitability, it's the equation of equity to me was the biggest challenge. And how do you overcome that when certainly the authority in Las Vegas makes millions in terms of its revenue, but that's nowhere near comparison to the billions that Uber and Lyft make, right? And so, I mean, if it comes down to sort of political, force power from a funding standpoint, all the authorities in the U.S. combined couldn't bankroll what Uber and Lyft are worth or what some of these other companies are worth. And then down the pike, we've got one more. It's SAE level 5 iteration of full autonomy. And I know we still sort of laugh this off, and it might be a decade away, but there is a future coming, and it might be a freight train, frankly, heading right directly towards this industry in which no longer are we dealing with TNCs utilizing minimum wage labor at $7 an hour, but promising 21. But frankly, we're dealing with robots and artificial intelligence driving a vehicle that doesn't even require a driver. Well, what about the equitability equation then? Those are the things that I think about from a sort of social and economical justice standpoint. And so when you say, what are the challenges facing the industry, I believe that it's all of those things related to not just the existence of what the taxi cab industry does right now, but what that existence looks like in 5 years, in 10 years. And then what happens to the value that was previously invested that has eroded considerably as we sit here today and may erode into the future? How do we come up with a solution to be able to mitigate those challenges, or frankly, can we? And then the answer might be we can't. We're too far sort of into time, if you will, to be able to correct anything that we've done in the past, because money spent isn't money that you're going to be able to recover to pay back into an equity that no longer exists. So it's equitability, and it's about making sure that as we traverse into the future, we're able to continue to provide the things that I think are worth value, such as the safety component, such as the QA/QC component, and then really translating that to the public so they can appreciate why you need that and the benefits of having that versus the benefit of not having that. And you're sitting in a vehicle that may or may not be insured, and so, God forbid something happens. And then you're chasing who? The driver who's signed on to an app, or maybe they got into an accident when the app was not quite picking up the next passenger, and therefore you weren't covered by the $1 million liability insurance, and you happen to run over a kid. Those are the challenges that I think we need to be able to better market the value of, so that we continue to exist into the future from a very much an oversight standpoint. But that is my humble opinion, and I would love to hear yours in terms of, what you're foreseeing as the challenges.
Mr. Hassan, could you identify the 3 priorities you would have for leading the authority if you were selected the administrator?
I was thinking about this as I was sort of preparing for this interview and doing a little bit of research, both on your website and looking over at the revised statutes. And the one thing that occurred to me was, and I think I've mentioned this, is you have to keep up with the times, and the times are changing. And so there has to be a level of innovation that I think with a lot of locations, and I apologize, I'm sort of going off on a tangent here. I think a lot of mistakes that other transportation taxi cab authorities made was not thinking that they have skin in the game and pushing off the burden of responsibility to the taxi cab companies, and hoping somehow that the larger of them would somehow come up with a solution. And they did, mind you. They did in a lot of locations, and they came up with their own apps, and it was good, and it's somewhat manageable. But I feel that I think we have a regulatory responsibility to undertake on the innovation. And so when I gave you the story about introducing microtransit, it was with that purpose in mind. And so I feel that one of the priorities out of the 3, possibly the number 1 priority, is making sure that we are keeping up with the technology that's out there. Because if we're not, then we'll essentially be left in the dust. 2 is this public education piece that I cannot, overstress, which is the value of what taxis provide to a city with a population of 700,000 or more, and frankly, how we differentiate what we do in this industry with what TNCs are bringing to the table. And it really does go to the heart of security and assurances and the whole liability portion. And nowhere in this conversation, in the news articles that I've kept up with over the years, do I really see that opinion piece conversation come to fruition, right? And I think it's pivotal if we're to differentiate ourselves from all the disruptive technologies that are already here and will be coming in the future. And part of what that means is, frankly, maybe changing the paradigms of the regs themselves to start something that hasn't even begun to fully happen yet, which is electrification of the fleet itself. the fleet that we obviously don't own as the authority, but I think the price point is at such a threshold that it might take just a little bit of a push to be able to convince our larger stakeholders to start investing in EV technology, and not because I feel that it's necessarily greener than, there's a whole conversation to be had, and I don't have an opinion one way or the other, but certainly you've got both sides of the fence between, oh, it's a wonderful green technology versus not. I'm simply very pragmatically saying that from a profitability standpoint, it makes far more sense to introduce EVs into the equation now when there is the capacity to do so from a range standpoint than to continue to delve into gasoline and diesel when you don't necessarily have to. And I think that in itself can create additional prospect within the authority itself moving forward, that gains that we have yet to realize. And then three, sort of a triangular approach is, you know, to a large degree, I want to say if these conversations have not been had internally to the organization, then, from where I left off to where we are right now, years later, employees can have a tendency to feel beat down, especially when the conversation surrounding the atmosphere is about laying off 2 or 3 more inspectors because the budget is going all over the place on a year-to-year basis because you have no control over your revenue because you're essentially at the mercy of the regulations that are at play. And with the pandemic, obviously, it's made it even worse. I think you need someone strong in terms of their leadership style to bring those people together and frankly be a stabilizing hand that gives them the assurance that he or she is there to fight for them and to make sure that this industry continues to be a viable and sustainable industry, and that you're not going to find yourself as a 30-year career inspector on the verge of retirement getting a pink slip, right? That and that's not a promise that I make on a policy standpoint. I believe that's a genuine level of trust that needs to be earned because you care about the people that are there. And so to me, that's sort of not 1, 2, 3 in terms of priority, but I would say a very triangular approach to having equity and parity between those 3 priorities.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan. Mr. Decker, could you just summarize for Mr. Hassan the process going forward?
Sure, Mr. Hassan. So thank you for interviewing. There was one other interview this morning and one person withdrew. There will be one tomorrow. It's been noticed and agendized on our website. My understanding is that the board will deliberate after that interview tomorrow. You will not be able to be present, but because it's going to be on the website, you may or may not be able to tune in. However, if you want to observe the board deliberating between the candidates, you can do that by tuning into the website tomorrow and observing that agenda item. You can find that link on our website on the agenda. The board will pick 3 names. Those 3 names will be submitted to the Director of Business and Industry, who will have the option of choosing one of those names to fill the position, or may re-interview, or may consider other options. However, that process will complete the process that you're involved in right now. So the board will pick the 3 names. They will send it to the Director of Business Industry, who's responsible for selecting the actual candidate. The board deliberation tomorrow is public, and you may watch the director's deliberation is not.
Very good.
Again, we thank you for your attendance and participating in the interview.
Wonderful. And again, my heartfelt thank you to all of you for taking the time to meet with me. And I appreciate the candor and the dialogue and the conversation. And I wish you the best of luck. All right. Take care.